This is Talking Drupal, a weekly chat about web design development from a group of people with one thing in common. We love Drupal. This is episode 470, Creating Recipes. On today's show, we're talking about creating recipes, what recipes already exist, and helpful tips and tricks with our guest, Jim Birch. We'll also cover features as our module of the week. Welcome to Talking Drupal. Our guest today is Jim Birch. Jim is an internet professional who can bridge the gap between technical staff and business goals with specialties in Drupal, front-end development, content strategy, and SEO. He's an accomplished strategist, developer, community organizer, and believer in bridging open source communities. He spends his days leading an incredibly talented team of Drupal engineers at Canopy Studios. Jim, welcome back to Talking Drupal, and thanks for joining us again.
Thank you for having me. Look forward to discussing recipes with you again.
Wonderful. I'm John Picozzi, Solutions Architect at EPAM, and today my co-hosts are joining us for the next 4 weeks. Aubrey Sambor, lead engineer at Lullabot. Aubrey specializes in CSS and accessibility with over 15 years of Drupal experience. She loves knitting, coffee, fountain pens, and a good IPA. Aubrey, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Can we talk a little bit about fountain pens? Writing with fountain pens, doing art with fountain pens, all of the above?
More writing with fountain pens. I have a bunch of them. I use them for journal writing, and I have a paper planner that I use here too. They're all right in front of me, my fountain pens. They're not very far from me at all times. It's really fun. You buy all these fun inks, and it's just a really fun way to kind of go through your workday. So yeah, they're pretty great. They're pretty cool.
Is it like I don't know, a love for the like tactile of like pen and paper sort of thing?
Yep, sure
Yeah.
is. I've always loved stationery, always loved pens, and fountain pens is just that next evolution for me. So yeah, they're pretty great.
That's flipping awesome. That's so cool. Yeah, I also like I'm the guy that gets like a physical newspaper, like the Wall Street Journal. Like anytime I'm at a hotel and I can get a Wall Street Journal and actually read the newspaper, I will do it. People are like, "What is your problem?" That it comes on tablets, and I'm like, "No, not the same." So completely understand that. That's awesome. Last but certainly not least, joining us as per the usual, Nick Laughlin, founder at Enlightened Development. What's going on, Nick?
Not too much. Happy to be here. And since we've been talking about recipes a lot lately, now I've created a couple, so I have a lot more to chat about. So I'm excited.
And now, freshly back from his DrupalCon Barcelona experience, and to talk about our module of the week, let's turn it over to Martin Anderson-Klutz, a senior solutions engineer at Acquia and a maintainer of a number of Drupal modules and recipes of his own. Martin, what do you have for us this week?
Thanks, John. Have you ever wanted an admin UI to manage sets of configuration, to version and share across Drupal sites? There's a module for that. It's called Features, and it was created in March of 2009 by user Wyhan. The recent releases are by Dave Reed. Now it has 7.x-2.15 and 8.x-3.14 versions available, the latter of which works with Drupal 9.4 and 10. Now it is marked as minimally maintained, but it does have security coverage and test coverage. And for documentation, it has a documentation guide and probably has hundreds, if not thousands, of tutorials available. It does have 610 open issues, 54 of which are bugs against the 8.x branch, which is not bad considering it's in use by almost 117,000 sites, though the majority of those are using the D7 version. Now, many listeners will remember Features as the de facto solution for configuration management in Drupal 7 and earlier. As the name implies, it was originally intended to share common capabilities across different Drupal sites. And unlike recipes, Features can have version numbers because there is a path to sync configuration updates across sites using a feature, though this is where a lot of teams found Features could be complex to use. Now, we did previously cover Features as module of the week all the way back in episode number 147, but I thought it was relevant to today's discussion because of the way it provides a UI for organizing and exporting specific sets of configuration. There is an open issue for features to directly export recipes because it already does a lot of the time-consuming work of collecting together necessary config files, including dependencies. But even in its current state, it could be a time saver for anyone wanting to start creating their own recipes. So let's talk about features.
So features. I'm not a huge lover of features, but Nick is. So I'm wondering, like, how many? Well, let me ask this: how many people on the panel are actually using features currently?
S-
Currently.
So leading up to today's call, I installed features for the first time in probably more than 5 years.
Okay. And like recipes kind of tie it together, right? Feels like a bit of a replacement for features, right? Like, yeah, Martin's shaking his head
Nodding, yes.
vigorously, nodding his head vigorously to that, right? So like, and I've heard, and I don't know this to be 100% accurate, but like features could at some point in a future life iteration be like a recipes exporter, maybe of some sort. Is that fair to say? Maybe.
So that's where there is that issue in the issue queue of features that sort of proposes that idea. There was a comment from one of the maintainers saying, you could decorate the specific class that, I think is responsible for the structure of how it gets exported. But notionally, if you look at the way features creates today, by default, basically a module, it has sort of that config install set of configuration files that are your configuration YAML, which effectively are the same thing that you would sort of potentially manually collect together as part of creating a recipe. And I know for myself, that's how I've tended to create them to date, is going through that manual process of picking a couple things that I know that I need, maybe seeing what things they need and picking those out one by one, and then typically testing it, realizing that there are a couple that I missed, and then having to sort of root for those and pull them in. Whereas the potential of using something like features is that it figures out that sort of tree of dependencies for you and collects those all together, and then also gives you a UI where you can manage those. And then that way, if you go back to update your recipe, you can sort of make all of the configuration changes through the UI, export those again, and then you have all of your updated configuration again in one place. That makes it easy to put into your recipe.
I think features was one of the standout modules of Drupal 7, right? It's the module that made managing a moderately complex site possible. It was the
Did
only
did
way to like
did
make changes on
everybody?
your local, export them.
Sorry, did everybody here use features with Drupal 7?
Yep,
Yeah,
I have.
everybody's shaking their head. So I'm literally the outlier that like avoided it like the plague. Got it. Okay, sorry, Nick. Continue.
Yeah, I don't know how you managed any moderately complex sites without using features. I mean, it was the only way to get config up. Now, features does do one thing that recipes doesn't really do out of the box. Well, I'm going to say out of the box, but you can do it with some workarounds. Like features isn't just about adding a feature to a site. It's also about maintaining a feature. So if you have modifications, it will do its best to make the upstream site match whatever's in the feature. Whereas recipes, if you just put config into the config folder, it will try to add that stuff, but if it already exists, it's going to throw an error. So if you want to modify existing configuration, you need to use an action. And features doesn't really know what config actions are yet. So I think the recipe generation aspect of whatever recipe generator the community ends up on, it kind of needs two or three pieces to it. One of those is, how do you collect all the config for a particular piece and just export that? Ideally, the second piece would be some sort of knowledge about what config actions are available and a way to assign things to a config action. Um, and then, how do you go about testing the recipes? Now, to be fair, we don't have any of that right now. And even just
Mhm.
collecting the correct configuration can be painful. And I think recipes already helps with that. I also want to point out, I think ECA has similar functionality, although it's not fully fleshed out. Like I know Jurgen has a way to export config for a particular ECA script or ECA flow so that he can debug things. And it kind of does a similar, like it gathers all the relevant config and exports it as a zip. So there's multiple ways to do that, but features, yeah, features was indispensable. Even just I would always use the diff module too, because you could see, what was different between your feature and whatever site you were trying to import it on.
Martin, question for you on one fact that I'm reading here. Usage, 117,000 sites are using it. Majority of those are D7. Do we think that features use is going to go way down after D7 end of life and after folks move off of, D7 for different versions of Drupal?
I think it's definitely accurate to say that, to the extent that people migrate away from Drupal 7, there's likely to be a corresponding drop in
Mm.
the overall usage of features. But that being said, I think it's a bit of an open question of how quickly that drop will happen. So, that's definitely something to keep an eye on for next year.
Interesting.
I think one thing that's interesting too is that features currently has more sites on Drupal 5 using it than Drupal 6, which it's not often you see a module that still has usage statistics for Drupal 5, but I think it's kind
I'd,
of funny.
I'd like to meet the person running that Drupal 5 site. Like, I feel like that's a labor of love there.
I think I remember seeing that there was actually a release for Drupal 5 of features not that long ago, but
Interesting.
yeah.
All right.
I'd like to add some clarity about the features involvement with recipes.
Oh, feel free.
That
Feel free.
this issue that Martin mentioned was opened in August of 2022 by Mr. Nedjo, who was kind of like the grandfather of recipes. He's since retired from Drupal development, but a lot of the groundwork was laid with him and Alex Pott. Dave Reed, one of the maintainers, added a "is features still needed? What a 4.x branch might look like" link to the issue. And then, yeah, Martin and Andy Post have been discussing the possibilities. I think the big risk now is that with recipes as experimental in Drupal core, they can still change.
Mhm.
So we are following a deprecation style workflow if things are changed. But, like any builders or things that extend recipes run the risk of basically the foundation of recipes being changed underneath them. So that's
Yeah.
why, like at this time, we're not really endorsing any recipe generators. But if one were to explore this avenue, features and what Jurgen has done in the ECA export module are great places for prior art, to look at and discover and build upon.
Yeah, and if I'm being honest, one thing that Drupal always struggles with is naming. I think features is one of the better named modules in the Drupal world. And it would be kind of ironic if it became a recipe generator, and by that token became a terribly named module that doesn't do what it says it does.
Well, so
Maybe it makes sense to credit.
I was just going to say, is there a process for in the Drupal community for changing the name of your module? Like,
No,
did you? We
no,
don't.
you
It's
can't.
basically shut it down and start a new one, right?
Yeah, you can't
Yeah,
change your
well, for
machine
the
name.
machine name anyway. Yeah.
Got it.
Yeah, so it makes sense to create a new recipe generator module or project or something more general because it's more of a features was a developer tool too, but it becomes much more of a local developer tool than something that you would have installed on websites and use. But we can certainly take inspiration either way from how features kind of gathers, the UI and how it gathers the config dependencies.
So we're kind of like, I don't know, we're future visioning features here, right? But I'm wondering like if there's a state where features kind of follows the same sort of idea as like Search API or the new AI, API in Drupal, right? Where it's like features core is like more of an API layer, and people can build plugins to do different things. And one of those plugins is kind of like, legacy features or like how features worked, previously. And then maybe one of them is like a recipe type exporter builder sort of submodule. I don't know. But anyway.
Yep.
So it sounds like we'll have to revisit this in like 6 months to a year, when recipes has more, maybe is less experimental, and maybe then there'll be another version of features that we can talk about. But for the time being, it sounds like you can use features as you have in the past, and export things into modules and import them into other sites if that's the road you want to go down. As always, Martin, thank you for bringing us another module of the week that is on topic and has provided us with an enlightening conversation. If folks wanted to suggest a module of the week, or just chat about this one, where could they do that?
Always happy to talk about modules of the week in the Talking Drupal channel of Drupal Slack, or folks can reach out to me directly as ManClue on all of the Drupal and social platforms.
Wonderful. Thanks a lot, Martin.
Thank you.
All right. Let's talk about our primary topic, which is creating recipes. So Jim's been on the show before to talk about recipes and the progress that they've made. Today's show, we've given Jim kind of the incredibly hard task of describing how to make a recipe, or how somebody might create a recipe, without allowing him to share a screen. So we're going to try to do that the best we can, and I have full faith in Jim's abilities. But before we dive into that, Jim, I'm just wondering if you can kind of give people who might not know an idea of what recipes are, and how we're using them in Drupal.
Sure. So at the highest level, recipes bundle years of expertise into repeatable, shareable solutions. So that's the elevator pitch for them.
Mm-hmm.
What they are is a way to deliver configuration changes to your Drupal site. So recipes contain no code. They only contain configuration and configuration changes. So basically, anything you can click together in the admin UI is what a recipe can contain.
So when we say they contain no code, right? There are YAML files in there that could constitute a recipe, but it's no actionable like PHP code, right? That's what you mean by that?
Correct. Yes. If you consider, I don't think the general consensus is that YAML files, which is yet another markup language, is code per se. It's just tab configuration files.
Fair enough. Yeah. I just wanted to, for somebody that's like, well, how do they do it? There's no code to it. It's magic. I wanted to kind of like provide some context there, that there is something under the hood that is being kind of transferred or moved from place to place.
Sure. Yeah. As Drupal and most of the CMSs on the internet move to no code or low code features, there is a lot of code behind the scenes that needs to make that happen. So, as Nick has delved into contributing a little bit into the recipes initiative, there is, layers upon layers of APIs and things that I have no idea about beneath the surface. I'm just a very good user of those tools. So yes, in the YAML files, you can import configuration just like you would from a module or from your site export. The magic really happens with config actions, which you had a whole show on quite recently. And config actions can alter existing configs. So this is something that you couldn't do before without update hooks or custom code. Like you could never get into Drupal's system configs, but now as a non-developer, I can go in and use a recipe to change the admin theme to Gin, or make sure that caching and the performance settings are turned on. So the config actions are really like the game changer here.
That config actions can act on existing configuration, right? So, as Jim mentioned, after the config action show that we had a couple weeks ago or a few weeks ago, I have since created a few recipes, and there are a couple of gotchas. And one of those is if you put configuration in the config folder of the recipe, that gets applied. If that config already exists, either because another recipe added it or that you already it's an existing site that had something similar, it'll throw errors. Like it'll say, "Hey, you're trying to apply config that already exists." But if you put that into a config action, it's basically saying, for simple config at least, it's basically saying, "Hey, whatever I want you to convert the configuration into this." And so that can be really good for things like what Jim just said, assigning the admin theme, or um, in our case, which we'll talk about the use case a little bit more, keeping configuration in sync between multiple existing sites.
So yeah, the configs that are in the config folder are very, we'll call them declarative. And the same thing would happen with a module if you had your config in the install folder. If you installed a module that had, search API dot settings dot index already in your system, that module installation would fail. So same with a recipe. So that's where config actions allow you to be a little bit more flexible. Sometimes you want that recipe to fail. So if the expectations of the recipe are that we can install these 4 configurations and you can't, then there should be a failure there. So yeah, it's finding the balance of your strict declarativeness of what your recipe needs to do versus being a little bit more flexible with config actions.
And then last but not least, Jim, content. Can we include content in recipes?
You can. Thanks for leading me on here. There is a folder next to your config folder called content. It's optional, but you can include default content in your recipe. This is not meant to be a deployment method of content. We have workspaces for that, and there are issues, long-standing issues with the default content module, like you don't know what node ID is going to be created for that node content. But we use default content for spinning up demo sites, or really cool for you doing QA work. How many developers have, built a couple pages out on their local to show their work they're doing, and then have to redo that on their multi-dev environment in the cloud. Now you could deploy a recipe and apply that content only recipe, and your QA work is done. So it's really a time saver there. So that is API that was added along with recipes called default content that consumes the default content config files. You still need the contrib module to create those config files. Technically, you could create them by hand, like maybe a menu link config is pretty easy. But when you get into things that have dependencies, like basically any other entity in Drupal, you want to use that module to make sure you export the file, the media, the user, the paragraphs, the blocks, like anything that's connected to a node.
How would you recommend somebody get started when they're creating a recipe? And as somebody who just got started, I'll have some opinions as well, and a couple other gotchas. But if you're talking to somebody today and they're saying like, I want to create my first recipe to do X, where do you point them? Where do you tell them to get started?
My first question would be, why would you want to do that? No, I'm just kidding. I appreciate your input here, Nick, because I've been working on recipes for a couple of years now. But I try to understand what they were trying to build and then point them in the direction of existing recipes and our documentation. So linked from our project page, the recipes initiative page, we have a 1.x branch that has a lot of documentation. And in that, we have a recipe author guide. Goes through the pieces of a recipe, what can go in them, and how to go about maybe working on it. And I actually have an issue to give it another pass. It's been a few months since we've been in there. Maybe we can add some helper steps in there too. And then existing recipes. So Drupal core has recipes. When we merged in the recipes API, we also merged in the standard profile rewritten as recipes. They are composable, so it's a suite of recipes. So you can do things like just get to the remote video media entity, or you could just get all the media entities, or you could install what was the standard profile as the standard recipe suite. So learning how we put those together can lead to more composable, easier to consume recipes and solutions that you can build your recipes off of. So you don't really need to make your own remote video media entity. I don't think any of us have done that even before recipes in Drupal 8 and above. Everybody just uses those core media entities. So you should continue to use them and extend them.
Yeah.
So the
Makes sense.
author guide is super useful. As Nick has said, he has dabbled in recipes. I've also gone through the exercise of creating recipe, and I was super excited about using the author guide and going through those steps. Before we go too far, somebody looks at the author guide, right? Recipes are have a similar folder structure to a module or a theme. So if you're familiar with building one of those, you kind of have the same ability to build a recipe, right, Jim? Like there's a recipes folder in the web root of your project. Yes, no?
Incorrect.
Correct me. See, I've already forgotten.
Yes. So recipes in the composer template that Drupal core recommends, the recipes folder goes above your web root, siblings to your config folder.
Okay. Right. All right.
Since recipes are not needed in Drupal, and Drupal does not depend on any recipes, it was decided that the recipes folder should not live inside of Drupal.
That makes complete sense.
Yeah, it's something that is supplementary to Drupal.
So having that recipes folder, right? You then kind of dig into kind of building your own custom recipe, right?
Sure.
My recipe. Yep.
One more point of clarity, as they are not similar to modules and themes, that recipe folder is a single folder. There's no idea of custom or contrib. These recipes, they should all be required with Composer or dependent on or committed to them if you wanted to do that. But recipes look for dependent recipes in a single location. So if your recipes need to require other recipes, they need to be in the same folder. The only special case for that is Drupal core. So Drupal core's recipes live at a specific spot, but all other recipes should be in the same folder.
And then within that folder, there are certain files that you have, similar to a module, but without the PHP code that we talked about, right? So it's going to have a composer JSON and a recipes.yaml file, right?
Yeah, the recipe.yaml file is the only requirement, and then the unique name on the folder that the recipe is inside.
And You'll notice Jim just corrected me very subtly there in the fact that I keep adding an S at the end, and it is singular, not plural. So just be aware. Just be aware of that. Okay. So like at that point in time, like you're putting some things into your YAML file, right? And you're kind of like off to the races, right? So I think we have a pretty good idea of what the structure looks like. Nick, I'd be interested to hear like what your experience was when you jumped into this.
Yeah, so I think the first thing to say is that the people that are behind recipes, that, like most visible, I think at the moment, Jim, Alex, and Adam, they've been very, very helpful with any of the questions that I have. I do have quite a few things that were minor points of confusion for me that might help somebody else starting out. One is, and some of these are going to be obvious when I say them, but they did confuse me at the time. So one thing is, for example, when you install a module, it doesn't go through the same with a recipe. When you say this module is required, it doesn't go through the same install process as if you installed it through the UI or through Drush, right? The optional config isn't going to be installed. You have to either include that in your config or you have to explicitly tell the recipe to install that. So it allows you in a lot of cases to have a cleaner install. Like you don't get config that you don't need. I think the exception is that anything that's marked as required by the module.
Anything that is simple configuration from a module is imported automatically. Simple configuration has 2 dots in it. So think module name dot settings dot YAML. But anything that are config entities, so that would be something with more than 2 dots. Think meta tag dot default dot front page. So that is a configuration
Yeah.
entity, and you need to explicitly import that because you might not need everything that a module has to offer. It's a chance to be more declarative in your recipes. And then you can import just all config. So in config import star would import all config, but that tells the recipe runner to get all the config since it doesn't know about folders in the config file, the installer, the optional, it's going to go get everything that's in there. So that's a little
Everything.
dangerous too, because before optional would fail silently when you install a module. In this case, it would fail maybe because you don't have the dependency of what that optional configuration is looking for. So that's a use case
Yep.
for being very declarative and only calling out. If you do want that optional config, then you add dependency for the Tor module and get the Tor config. So you have complete control over what you can import from a module that you install using recipes.
And that's kind of the next big kind of gotcha that hit me in that is that when you depend on another recipe too, or when you list recipes as sub recipes, those recipes get installed first and they don't know about each other. So if you're building multiple recipes, you can't be like, well, you can't think that your system knows that recipe A is going to be applied first, so you can build on top of that. A simple example: if you depend on the node module, right, um, and you're building an install recipe from scratch, if you have 2 recipes that are sub recipes that both depend on the node module, and you don't tell the recipe system that they both depend on the node module, you can run into errors because it doesn't. When it tries to validate the recipe, it goes, "Hey, you're installing node configuration, but the node module isn't a dependency." So I ran into that myself when I was trying to just build kind of a giant site-wide recipe that you could just install and get something set up. I just ran into it over and over again where I thought I like knew recipe X is going to be applied first, and it had the node module installed, and recipe B uses that, and so it should have it available. Doesn't work like that.
One
Um,
of the initiatives that was working with recipes was the config validation initiative. And the
Yep.
config validation in recipes is extremely strict, more strict than Drupal core.
Yes.
We do have issues to make this developer experience better. One is create a way for recipes to check their preconditions. That's 346, 3641, which would basically help the recipe runner check the dependent recipes to see if they install what you
Yeah.
need, basically. So, yeah, what you are describing, I wouldn't call it a bug because it helped you make more valid recipes, but it could be a little bit more lenient. So that's a feature request.
Yeah. Yep. And then I think the final thing that got me a couple times is the core recipes, is particularly the install profile, the standard install profile is good for reference, but it's also deceptively more complex than it seems. So you definitely want to be careful. I think if you're building a recipe for the first time, you should maybe start with something that's a little bit smaller and a lot more like a specific feature, like an event content type with a couple, like maybe a view or two, rather than trying to build a full site install for like, hey, we have we're an agency and we always deal with nonprofits. In this particular case, we want to build a giant recipe that you just run, installs the site, and you can move forward. That's really ambitious. I would recommend caution against install recipes. They're until you're more familiar with recipes.
So clearly I'm more of a fly by the seat of my pants kind of guy, because my use case when I was playing with recipes was literally like, I need to basically create a site install profile. I want to install a starting point for a site and be able to kind of reuse that easily, right?
As long as the starting point is a subset of standard with maybe a couple modifications, that's probably fine. If the starting point is a very complex site with with a few content types and tens of components and a bunch of views and custom stuff, if you're not familiar with recipes, you're going to run into wall after wall after wall.
I was building up to that,
Yeah.
right? So like started with, my path was start with actually taking the standard site install recipe, and I copied that and was like, I don't need this stuff in there. So I took some stuff out, right? And then I was like, all right, how do I get my custom content block in there? So started doing the default content stuff. And then, started asking some questions around layout builder and how to potentially get layouts in there. Adam and Alex kind of gave me the heads up that like, that might be trickier than you think right now. I said, okay, I'm going to hold off on moving forward with that. Got some insight from some folks in the community about ways to move forward with that, issues on D.O to kind of make config actions kind of that would help with that. But yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think that, start small and get bigger. Yeah, I would agree with Nick. Like, don't start big and try to figure it all out at once, but boil the ocean, some may say. But yeah, I don't think starting with like a site installer replacement is necessarily a bad idea.
Yeah, the ones that I've seen have the easiest step, like a big kind of turning point, I think, for recipes was when Kevin Quillen shared his starter recipe. And it wasn't I'm going to make a website for a nonprofit today with all the features. It was, what do we do the first 6 hours of setting up a Drupal site? So he was able to, set Jim as the admin theme and set the permissions and install a couple base modules. And if you look at that starter, you can see it reflected in a lot of like agency starters that are out there. So from that starting point, you can break it up into more smaller composable pieces. But yeah, the ones that try to replace their install profile with, the 500 configs that are in there with a 500 config recipe, usually run into yeah, the smallest little issues, because there's a setting on a CK editor that config that didn't get ported over or is failing or isn't compatible with something else. So yeah, you run into some deep maybe bugs in recipes and just improper configuration.
So, if you're interested in learning more about recipes, where else can you find recipes that already exist if you want to look up how other recipes have been constructed?
We've been promoting the Drupal recipes cookbook, which we made maybe a year ago. It's a documentation page or a wiki page on Drupal.org, so anybody can edit and add to it. We have it broken up into different sections where we have these huge site starter recipes, and we have functionality based recipes, and then some helpful tools like features in the ECA, and there's even like a Drush generate recipe script that will like basically just scaffold the file in the folders for you. Um, you know, People like those kind of things instead of just right clicking and making a new folder.
Mm.
But you know,
Can you can you, can you read that URL off for our listeners so that they can find it pretty easily?
it is a very, very long URL. So no, I can't. But if you go to the Drupal recipes initiative page, there is a link to it that makes it easier.
Yeah, and we'll have it in the show notes as well, so you can get there.
Nick
But
has
yeah,
made an
there's like
issue.
10 segments.
Yeah, Nick has made an issue on Drupal.org to make a short URL for that really, really long URL. The next place to find recipes I have found is on Drupal Packagist. So you can use the API or search type Drupal-recipe. So recipes that are on Drupal.org are encouraged to set up a general project, not a module or a theme. They just have general projects. And if your composer type is Drupal recipe, they will show up on Drupal's Packagist and the packagist.com. And then if you search there, you can also see lots of agency and test recipes that people are creating. So maybe they're not explicitly sharing with the world, but they are out there publicly.
Is that, just out of curiosity, is that what Project Browser is going to use to pull recipes into Project Browser?
Funny you should ask. I'm working on a contrib module with my coworker Sean Dietrich called API Browser, which creates a config entity where you can create more project browsers. And one of those is you could just connect to Packagist and pull in Drupal recipes. So I actually have a config file that goes with it, which is, I think, like just Canopy recipes. And I have the ECA recipes, which is cool to see them all in a browser. So right now, no, the project browser isn't really worrying about recipes. The functionality has been added by Adam to work with Drupal CMS. But beyond that, it's up to the contrib community to, I think, extend project browser to do more things like that.
Got it.
There's also a gentleman, I can't remember his name, working on a GitLab API browser kind of thing too. So that'd be cool. I haven't worked much with GitLab. Another place to look at to find recipes, we mentioned Drupal core, but the Drupal CMS repository has the start of recipes. So I know we sprinted for the DrupalCon Barcelona Dries note. So I have two SEO recipes in there, a basic SEO and an advanced SEO. And Martin has the event recipes pretty well built out. So he has the core event recipe and the add-ons that he demoed at his session in Barcelona, which you can add on event registration, event calendar, and event locations, I think. And then
Hmm.
as Drupal CMS advances over the next 4 months, you're going to see more and more recipes go in there.
Cool. Do you have a favorite recipe?
I do. Of course, saplings is the recipe that I've been working on at Canopy for 2.5 years. Really flushed out, although we're always finding ways to improvement when we use it on projects. But it's standardized our new builds with content types and fields and paragraph components. So it's helped made us more efficient and helped us kind of make a product that we can customize, but it all starts from the same base. What really intrigues me, though, is what I like to call snack-sized recipes. So, I want a recipe that I can apply to uh, all 400 sites that we support. I think at Lullabot, you have architectural decision records.
Yep, we sure do.
And
Yep.
I've talked with some of your coworkers about how could we use recipes to enforce these decisions, like when you bring on a site that somebody else built, and it's not wrong, but it's wrong. It just needs to be a little bit differently. How about a recipe that can just be applied and just make small little changes? So I wrote this recipe when I was working on some Lighthouse performance improvements called Remote Video YouTube Light Embed. Just like rolls off the tongue. But it has only a recipe file and a composer file. And it requires a Drupal module and an npm package that changes the default YouTube embed to this new one that a performance specialist made. And it actually just loads the picture. And when you hover over it or scroll near it, it actually loads the embed. So your initial page load is a lot faster. And then it uses a config action to update the field widget on the remote video media entity. So I know every site that I work on has that video entity, the remote video media entity. So I can just apply this recipe to every site that comes in and increase the Lighthouse scores by 5 points.
Okay, so looking at the remote video YouTube Lite, it has a type of site in the recipe YAML file. Are types actually, do they really mean anything beyond like general categorization? Does it matter what type you set?
It does not. Yeah, it's a great observation and a great question. Yeah, decide and update recipe naming and classification standards. That's issue 3421666 with a fitting issue number. But yeah, here's where naming things is very hard. And one, like the Drupal core recipe names are, to me, backwards. They're unique name underscore Drupal name. So page underscore content type and article underscore content type, instead of content type underscore article and content type underscore page. And then, yeah, we have a list of site of recipe types in the documentation, but that is where they only live. So nothing enforces it.
Okay.
But we will need a way for discoverability and findability of recipes when we have hundreds and thousands of them. So actually, I propose that there isn't enough classification, that we should have a type and then another one. But yeah, there's some ideas like atomic design, atoms, molecules, organisms. There's the folks at Redfin thought up ingredients, dishes, and meals, which I thought was pretty clever. So yeah,
I like that.
but so far nothing consumes that, and I would expect the first thing that would be Project Browser, because as you're exploring recipes, do you want to show the tag taxonomy by itself? that doesn't make much sense to a marketer, but if you do want a way to add tags to an article, the article tag recipe would be much better than just the tag taxonomy.
It's interesting because earlier
Yeah.
you called your remote video YouTube light in bed. You're right, it does roll right off the tongue. Like a snack module.
Yep.
And for those of you who are listening to this, we're recording this at lunchtime, so I'm actually a little bit hungry right now. But I thought it was interesting that, like, hey, I have this snack recipe, right? And then like you could have like a main dish recipe that's like more of like a bigger recipe. So it's interesting that there's thought there to kind of associate the different courses of a meal with recipes. So moving along, right? We've talked about kind of how you structure your recipe, how you kind of get started building your recipe. We've talked about where you could find other recipes to use as an example or possibly incorporate them. I want to talk a little bit more about how you do that. So, like, how do you include an existing recipe in your own recipe? And that is possible, right?
It is. So if it is a contributed recipe, you would want to require that recipe from your composer file, and then require it from your recipe.yaml file. So the first three fields in your recipe.yaml file are name, description, and type. Your fourth, with the order of the recipe runner, if you are requiring dependent recipes, is the recipe section. So if you required them, your dependent module using Composer and it installed in your folder, all you need to do is put the recipe name there. So it's recipes : and then underneath that it's dash recipe name and dash recipe name. The only exception is that if you want core recipes, you would put dash space core / recipes / recipe name. And the order of the recipes is important. So if you required a recipe, but you want to make sure the media entities are there first, you would want to require those core recipes first and then your dependent recipe.
So with that, it's cumulative, right? So they kind of build on top of each other.
Yeah. So the recipe runners, and this is what applies the recipe. First applies recipes, and it will loop through any recipes that you have, and then it's going to move into the module install, and then it will install those modules and loop through all of them, and then it will go to the config import from the config folder and import all those configs, and then it'll loop through config actions, run all those, and then it'll loop through the default content.
So it's very logical as to how you set up your recipe, and that's the order in which things kind of run, right?
Yeah.
So question.
Well, actually, the recipe APIs, the sections of them run in that order, no matter how your recipe YAML file could be all unorganized. But inside of the loop, it runs in order.
Right. Okay. So yes, you could, I guess, order it however you want, but the recipe guide, right, puts them into the order that they're going to run in, so that your brain can kind of make sense of that. Right?
Yes.
Question on the module install piece of it. When you have a recipe that you're using, are those if that recipe requires modules, are those being run separately at the time of that recipe being executed, or is it kind of grouping all of the module installation together and doing it all at once?
So the second step after the recipes is install, which will install the modules that you list there.
But so I guess I'm asking, if you have, and this is where talking about things in code on a podcast are hard, right? So I'm talking about, like, if you require, so let's use a let's use the example you just used with media, right? So if I require like the media recipe, right? Because I'm going to use media in my recipe, right? Is it going to go ahead once it gets to that first part where you define that recipe and go into the recipe and install the media library module and all that stuff? Or is it going to bundle all of those module installs together and do them all at once?
The first. So it's
Okay.
recipeception. So if you're going into another recipe, it's going to make
It's
sure
going
that
to complete
installs
that
and then go back
and then go
back in.
So truly cumulative in the fact that it's going through step by step, running through the steps and doing all of the stuff and building on top of it. Got it.
Yeah.
Makes sense.
So how would you recommend people test the recipes? And I guess there's two sides to this. One is testing it, actually applying it, and then also like functional tests or automated tests. How can people test the recipes to ensure that they're the most stable they can be?
Uh, well, when you're creating recipes, and this is what I kind of want to expand on in the author guide, like do some real life experience, is I usually have two local environments. So you can spin up your DDEV or Lando or Doxel, and you have one where you're going to create the recipe. So you can click through, based on an existing configuration or starting from scratch. And then once you create your recipe, copying that over to a second install that can be blown away, like do drush site install, drush SI, reset it, and then reapply that recipe over and over again until you get it right. That way, you're not influenced, you're not getting anything that is kind of cruft to the recipe. The biggest thing we're testing for right now is item potency, as Martin mentioned earlier. Item potency is a computer science term that basically says you should have the same action if you do things multiple times to it. So if all things are even and I apply this recipe, uh, you should be able to apply it twice. So this is good for any recipe that needs to be extended. There are use cases where that's just not possible. So say I install the meta tag module, and then I use config actions to alter those. Actually, I install the meta tag module, I import all of its configuration, and then I use config actions to change that configuration. If I were to apply that recipe again, it was fail because it can't reapply those meta tag defaults because I've changed them.
Yeah.
So in an instance like that, that's where I need to maybe use create if not exists config action, or not import the configuration from the module. So, there are some times where I want to do this and this is the way it needs to be done and my recipe is declarative and you can't get it item potent. But for anything that you're going to build
Yeah.
upon, just applying it twice will do that. And there is a test in Drupal CMS in each of the recipes, a functional test that tests that basically or confirms it. We do have on our phase 2 roadmap, where is that we need testing in recipes. There isn't a way to
Yep.
test recipes in core. It would be really cool if we could come up with a GitLab standard that any recipe creator could use rather than having to write their own tests like crazy. So if you Google the recipes phase 2 roadmap, we just have a meta issue called support automated tests of recipes. That's 345-2995.
And I've actually written a recipe that's actually being used by a client right now or getting ready to be used. And that's to help keep track of keep CSV headers in sync between multiple sites. So they manage, I don't know, 10 or 15 sites. And whenever they have a new service, they need to deploy it to all of them. And that's been mainly, we use config management, but it's still mainly a manual process at the moment. We have to manually load up the local environment for every single site, change CSP settings, and then move forward. And this was one of the use cases I thought of for recipes first. And we set this up last week. So we have a recipe now. So now the process is they load up one of the sites, make the change, export that config, take that copy to the recipe, and then they can deploy that recipe to every single site and just apply it. And I set up kind of here's the way I set it up, and let me know what you think, because I think it's it needs some refinement, but it's pretty helpful. I kind of have a parent folder, and that parent folder has a recipes subfolder, and that recipe is where I put all the recipes I'm working on in. Because remember, you want ultimately, if you're creating a recipe that you're going to put out into the world, they all need to be their own Git repository. Whether you're putting them on Git on Drupal.org or you're putting them in GitHub or something for private packages, they need to be a Git repo. Then a sibling to that is just a DDev site. And then I have a scripts folder, and the script has kind of a couple of things. One, it has kind of the refresh command. So it does the whole, like, it blows away the old DDev site, installs a new site, and then applies the recipe. So you can kind of see how it works with kind of a default, a non-existing site. And then there's another command that will do the same thing, but it'll just apply it won't blow away the site first. It'll just apply the recipe. And that's where I learned how important the simple config action, how important that was. Because yeah, you're right. The first thing we did was just put it in the config folder, and it applied great the first time. But if you tried applying it again, it would throw a bunch of errors. But if you put it in simple config, it just updates the config and makes it match. Now, one thing we haven't mentioned yet that's really important is recipes can't delete things, right? So this isn't going to be a situation where you can use it to keep all these features in sync across the board, but it's really good, I think, in this case, for keeping small pieces of functionality in sync across kind of sibling sites, essentially. And then we actually wrote a DDev custom command to just apply the recipe, because again, that's a repeatable function. You have to require, Composer require the project, pulls it down, you apply it, and then you remove remove it from Composer, and then you just have to export the config and deploy that. So, yeah, you definitely want to test both of those use cases, though. You want to test applying it to a bare site, and you want to test applying it to a site that already has the config if it's something you're going to want to apply multiple times.
So maybe this is a benefit, or maybe this is just me being new and dumb. But because I was using my recipe as a replacement for an install profile, I was literally just rerunning it in the same like DDev folder structure thing every time, just blowing away my site and like, oh, yep, that piece works. Okay, moving on to the next one. Oh, that piece works.
Yeah, if you're working cumulatively, like building upon your recipe and just doing small chunks, then yeah, that's great. But like, if you build a content type that failed, because you forgot something, then you had already blown away the recipe.
Well, yeah. I was running into areas where I was like, oh, I wish I still had that config export, because like now it's gone.
Yeah.
Or like areas where I'm like, oh, I forgot to export the config. Would have been helpful if I had done that before I'd blown the site away.
That's why I like few environments, and I'm still a fan of environment indicator, where I have a banner at the top that says don't delete this one, or yeah. And then what Nick's talking about is a little like evil genius kind of with his like DevOpsy setup. That's an advanced, but the takeaway that I heard from that was that recipes are helping you be consistent. They're helping you not miss a site or two, like taking a little human error possibility out of the way. And that's one thing, like my coworker Ann Bonham, like, she always tells me, she's like, this is helping us be better developers, because we've already programmed XYZ that we want to do in configuration, and we ensure that we do it. with these recipes, that you didn't miss a tiny little thing. You didn't launch the site and forget to turn on CSS caching.
I mean, that's like, I don't want
Yeah.
to. I don't want to dive down the human error rabbit hole here, but I'm going to, because like that's one of the biggest benefits I see with recipes is like it removes that human error possibility, right? Because I think we've all probably launched sites or done things and where like, oh, we forgot to, speaking of rabbit holes, turn on the rabbit hole module and configure it to hide certain things, or oh, we forgot to aggregate JS and CSS, or just those silly little things, not silly, but like just those little things that we do on every site that like now we can build a recipe to say, hey, here's your pre-launch checklist. Let me just go through and like, yep, all this stuff's done. And oh, by the way, you did forget to aggregate JS and CSS. Okay, now we're going to do it. Okay, it's done. Go.
Yeah, a launch checklist. I have a module called launch checklist, which is based on the checklist API. But we've been talking about how a recipe that would go along with that would just go through and make sure you've done all the things that you've checked off would be a good recipe.
So, are there any tools that make creating a recipe easier? Do you have any of those in your toolbox to help out with the creation?
Definitely not. There's no tools that should be used. Learning about configs and dependencies will make you a stronger human, going through all that frustration and learning.
I agree with that, but I feel like you're just messing with us.
Okay, there are some tools. So I should caveat this by, I said earlier that, because the recipes APIs are all experimental, because right now the only config actions come from Drupal core, but technically any module could create a config action. So it would be hard for, right now we're using simple config update to change meta tags config, and Nick's using that to change the CSP config. But the CSP module and the meta tag module could provide their own config actions to be able to manipulate their configs easier. So the tools might not know about that, any like recipe builders or stuff like that. So we started this show off with Martin talking about the features module, very fringe, bringing back a blast from the past. Very experimental, not approved, but it'll probably work. I've never used it. So the last time I used features was using features builder module in Drupal 7, which used Drush to build the features. Anyways, probably the most important tool is Drupal Recipe Unpack. This is a composer plugin that extracts the recipes composer.json require dependencies into your website's composer.json file. There is an issue to use this as art to get it into core. So in theory, we could require a recipe, apply the recipe, unpack the dependencies to the site's composer.json, and then remove the first requirement of the recipe if you wanted to. So it really is ephemeral, like that recipe didn't even exist. So that's something that's working on. It's on our phase 2 roadmap. Until then, we're using Jonas Legasse's Drupal Recipe Unpack. Sorry, I've never met him or said his name out loud before. So yeah, that's a really cool tool. There's the recipe generator I mentioned, which scaffolds out a recipe folder for you. There's the Drupal ECA recipe module that allows you to export your ECA, your event condition action model, as a Drupal recipe. that's cool because it makes ECAs shareable and reusable, if you can. And they have a whole suite of example recipes that you can check out. And then the latest one, somebody spun up a Drupal recipes autocomplete extensions for IDEs such as VS Code to provide autocomplete functionality for Drupal recipes. And somebody posted this, that PHP Storm does this automatically without a plugin or anything like that. So yeah, I guess PHP Storm could be added to that list too.
Interesting. So many different tools. As you said, they're all kind of like moving around. We've talked a lot about creating recipes. I think we all have a pretty good idea of the steps that we need to do that, or at least to start down our recipe adventure. I'm wondering though, like, recipes is new. We're building out kind of the ecosystem of recipes. You talked about an SEO recipe. There are various other types of recipes out there. But I'm wondering, are there any recipes that are needed or that don't currently exist that would be helpful to if somebody was like, oh, I want to jump into recipes, like, where could I start?
As part of our initiative, we have 2 issues to create recipes from the umami profile and the minimal profile. Now, I think I built out the minimal profile, which is super nothing recipe, which may not even be needed or merged in by the core developers. But umami would be another cool experiment to replace that as a recipe profile. Outside of core, Drupal CMS has defined what they call tracks, and each track is going to create at least one recipe. And then, from what I've seen in people pop in, get excited about the recipes, come into the Slack channel, talk about site feature solutions and industry solutions, like I need a fundraising campaign for a nonprofit site. I need e-commerce. I mean, is somebody working on replacing Drupal Kickstart, Commerce Kickstart as a recipe? I don't think so.
Ryan, if you're listening, that sounded like something right up your alley.
I mean, how many sites in the world started off their website using Commerce Kickstart, even though they were like, don't use Commerce Kickstart to start your website? So some of those tools could be packaged together. It would, maybe jumpstart people using Drupal Commerce for smaller to mid-market.
I think that's a better use case too, because whenever I build a commerce site, I don't use Commerce Kickstart, but there's so much setup you have to do for a commerce site that, I don't use Commerce Kickstart because I don't want to be locked into a distribution in the update pathway and the pain that provides. But there's also so much extra work that you just have to do to get a commerce site working.
Yeah.
And a lot of it's like one-time setup that you never remember, and you end up having to look, okay, you're 17 levels deep in the menu to set up the shipping or packaging or something, just to enable shipping enabled purchases. But if you had a Kickstart recipe, I would worry less about the configuration that gets applied that I don't need, because I can easily undo that. Or if it's not used, then it doesn't matter. But I'm not locked into the distribution for an update and security pathway, but I get the kind of starter kit for a site. I mean, that would be fantastic.
Yeah, and if
I
somebody,
don't envy the person that has to create it though.
yeah, and as somebody that knows that system and those systems, if you could set it up in a composable way where you don't need to install absolutely everything, you can just install certain features. Like I just sell downloads. I don't need any shipping features. So
that was what I was going to say. Like, recipes kind of lends itself to that. where it's like you could build that kind of ecosystem of e-commerce recipes where it's like instead of, e-commerce Kickstarter, it's like e-commerce basic, right? That's just like a very basic setup. And then you have, Jim, to your point, file downloads or subscriptions, right? So like subscriptions and licenses is a whole nother part of commerce that is, often used. So I mean, like you could definitely kind of build out a whole ecosystem of like commerce related recipes. Maybe that's a great place for folks to get started who are listening to this. Like build a commerce recipe. Sounds
Other
great.
suites like that, the ECA and the AI
Mm.
initiatives, they have dozens of submodules and they're growing all the time. Like, could be configure some things out of the box. So yeah, the possibilities are endless. I think we're just at the infancy of recipe creation.
I feel like recipes could also be a tool for examples, right? Like, and what I mean by that is like ECA, for me feels super complicated, right? If I could install a basic ECA recipe and like see how it was put together, like it would give me more clarity as to how to use ECA.
Those already exist. There's at least 30 examples that they have set up as docs, and you can use. They're all available on Packagist, and you can apply the recipes using Composer.
Well, now I know what I'm doing after this.
Not eating lunch?
While eating lunch.
All right. So, Jim, if people want to help move the recipes initiative forward still, where can they get involved?
We meet every 2 weeks in Slack. We have our recipes initiative project page. So this is run as a project that is actually a fork of Drupal core. So this was very important before we got our patch into 10.3, where we were iterating every day and not bothering the core maintainers. We still iterate on our branch for larger items, and that's where we keep a lot of the issues, or at least issues start. And then some issues are moved to Drupal core. And when that happens, we always use the recipes initiative tag. So in Drupal core now, there is the default content system, there's the recipes API, and then the config entity system has always been there. So there are 3 categories in Drupal issue queues, but if you follow the recipes initiative tag, you can find all the core issues that are around recipes. But yeah, joining us in Slack and saying, hey, what's going on? Checking out the phase 2 roadmap of what we deem important for our phase 2. The sooner we can get through phase 2, phase 3, I believe, is recipe generating tools. So I know that was everybody's interested in that, but we really don't want to work on that until we get more stability in recipes. And you can use recipes now. It is in 10.3 and 11. The code is experimental, but Alex Pott, the main maintainer, is making sure we follow like a standard deprecating workflow. So even though we are changing things, simple _config _update config action was renamed to simple camel case config update. Same with creative not exist. So now all our config actions are camel case, not underscored and camel case. So recipes won't break until there's a deprecation message, and I think 11.1 is when that would happen. So yeah, recipes are safe to use now. And then, I guess grace is requested, while this is super cool and we got it in its core as experimental, and, all the pressure's on the recipes initiative because it's the foundation of Drupal CMS. There are still only a handful of developers that actually work on the recipes issues. And I'm not one of them. I'm definitely ambitious site builder and documentator and recipe author. So yeah, it takes all kinds. So like, yeah, if you are a developer or a strategist or UX professional or a documentator or a project manager, we could, use all sorts of help in the initiative.
Great. Well, Jim, as always, thank you for joining us. Thank you for sharing all this great information about recipes. And, I think you succeeded in giving people a pretty good idea how they can start creating recipes of their own. So thank you for that.
Sure. And yeah, jump into Slack like Nick did and ask all your questions, because there are no dumb questions. We've all been there, or you're finding new bugs, which, Nick has, found bugs and made improvements, like that issue to shorten the URL in the recipes cookbook. Once that happens, it's going to be a great improvement.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. Do you have any questions or feedback? You can reach out to Talking Drupal on Twitter with the handle Talking Drupal, or by email with show@talkingdrupal.com. You can connect with our host of listeners on Drupal Slack in the Talking Drupal channel.
You can promote your Drupal community event on Talking Drupal. Learn more at talkingdrupal.com/tdpromo.
Get the Talking Drupal newsletter to learn more about our guest hosts, show news, upcoming shows, and much more. You can sign up for the newsletter at talkingdrupal.com/newsletter.
And thank you, patrons, for supporting Talking Drupal. Your support is greatly appreciated. You can learn more about becoming a patron at talkingdrupal.com and choosing the Become a Patron button in the sidebar. Alrighty. Jim, if folks wanted to get a hold of you to talk about recipes or really anything, what and how could they do that?
Ping me in the Drupal Slack in the Pound Recipes channel. You can find me. I am at the Jim Birch in the Slack, and Jim Birch on the LinkedIn. And you can find me to work with at Canopy Studios.
Awesome. Aubrey, what about you?
Yeah, you can find me mainly on Mastodon. I'm pretty active there. I'm on labyrinth.social/starshaped. I do have a Twitter, but I don't use it. You can follow me there, but you won't get any messages from me because I don't post there anymore. You can find me on LinkedIn at Aubrey Sambor. And I'm trying to think of what else. Drupal.org, I'm also star-shaped. So if you want to look me up on the Slacks or on Drupal.org, I am star-shaped there.
Awesome. Nick, what about you?
You can find me pretty much everywhere at Nixvan, NICXVAN.
And I'm John Picozzi. You can find me on all the major social networks as well as Drupal.org at John Picozzi. And you can find out about EPAM at epam.com.
And if you've enjoyed listening, we've enjoyed talking. See you guys next week.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks.